again. So last week we spoke about the mitzvah of Shemitta as it appears in the Torah, and what seems to be, if we can ask, what are the reasonings right behind the mitzvah of Shemitta? And we spoke about three different goals, not excluding each other, not contradicting, but complementing each other. Three different goals it seems the Torah is setting for the mitzvah of Shemitta. One is the social goal, which is highlighted more in Parashat Mishpatim, and which says that we want more equality. 6 years, the people that are the owners of what in maybe in modern language we would call the means of productions, which is the ground back then. So if I have land, that means that I can produce fruits, which is basically what is being produced. And if you don't own land, then I own you in the end, because you would be a worker in my field. So the seventh year is a way to make everyone equal, because in the seventh year, I as the owner am not allowed to plow or to harvest or to use my field as it is mine, but instead rather everyone is equal. I must allow everyone who wants to enter the field or the orchard or whatever it would be and take whatever he wants, and I'm not allowed to work more than the others. So it is an equalizer. So that's one goal of the mitzvah of Shemitta, a social goal. The second goal, which is highlighted in Parashat Behar, is the Shemitta as a source of holiness, as a source of Kedusha. And that is, just as in Shabbat, on the seventh day of the week, I stop working, I cease of any activity, and then when I cease from any productive activity, I have the time for spiritual activity. That's what happens on Shabbat. And on a much larger scale, if we speak about a whole year of someone taking a sabbatical year and learning and developing himself in the spiritual side, then that is the second goal of the mitzvah of Shemitta. The third goal of the mitzvah of Shemitta, which in a way underlies the first two, is for everyone to understand and to get the notion that in the end, everything in Eretz Israel, but everywhere, but the Shemitta highlights that regarding Eretz Israel, the land belonged to God and not to us. As the Torah says explicitly, Kili kol haaretz, to me, not me, God, mine is the whole land. Gerim vetoshavim atem imadi. You are like residents in my land, on my land. And by the mitzvah of Shemitta, we have a strong feeling that it's not ours to decide when we work it or when we let it to rest. God decides for us that the seventh year would be a year of rest. And also by understanding that the land is not really ours, but belongs to everyone, that is also the reason that would encourage us to share it with others. Because if I feel that everything belongs to me, then that's one of the first words that small children learn very early on. Mine or sheli, fine. If you understand that it's not really yours, but let's say it's your parents, so maybe you would be more willing. We're still working on that. I hope that I would report about the results of the study. But hopefully, if you are able to teach them that it doesn't really belong to them, they would be more willing to share it with siblings or friends. In the same manner, we all grown-ups are just grown-up children. So if we are being taught that everything belongs to our Father in heaven, right, that everything belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then maybe there is a better chance for us to share more willingly with others. And of course, if we understand that the land belongs to God, then we will have more of a motivation for holiness, for sanctity. We would understand that our fortune does not depend only on our actions, but also, or maybe primarily, on our adherence to the divine commands. So we would not be fearful that by letting the land rest in the seventh year, we would lose something, because we would know that in the end, everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it is better for us to invest in our spiritual growth. So these are the three basic dimensions or goals of the mitzvah of Shemitta, as we spoke about last week, and we saw the sources at length, and we have uploaded the YouTube, the shir to YouTube, and you are if you didn't see it yet, then you are encouraged to see it. Okay. Now we want to continue to a question which is still theoretical. We are not yet in speaking about the practical of what you can or what you cannot and what you must and what you must not do on Shemitah year. There is one more extremely important fundamental theoretical question that we need to explore first. And that is the question of, is Shemitah in our time, meaning our time is after the destruction of the temple, our time is after the time of the exile. On the other hand, our time is when, Baruch Hashem, we are being gathered back to Eretz Israel. So with all these complexities, is Shemitah binding right now from the Torah? Maybe from the Torah, Shemitah does not apply today, and it's only a rabbinical obligation or duty. Or maybe, as we would see, there is such an opinion, maybe Shemitah nowadays is like a nice minhag, but not even a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. There is even such a, what we may call a radical opinion, but it does exist. So that's what we are going to explore today. And we can all understand that this question has very important ramifications on what would be allowed and what would not be allowed. How much can we be lenient regarding the Shemitah? Because the basic assumption is, now there are exceptions to this rule all over the halacha, but the basic assumption is that if something is a Deorayta, meaning it's biblical in its origin, then we would be more strict about it. If something is the Rabbanan, meaning it's rabbinical in its authority, then we can be more lenient. That's not to say, chas v'chalila, that we are being lightheaded with mitzvah d'Rabbanan. So, for example, the issur, the prohibition on eating chicken with milk, according to most opinion, is the Rabbanan. I'm sure no one here would ever dream to be lightheaded regarding it. So we do not say chas v'chalila we should be more, in any way, be mezalzel in Isurei de Rabbanan. What we mean is that, for example, when there is a dispute between Rabbanim regarding a specific act, is it prohibited or is it allowed, then in cases of Deorayta, we need to be more strict and follow the stricter opinion, while in cases of the Rabbanan, we would be allowed to follow the more lenient opinion. So, and as Shemitta, as in any other area of halacha, there are many machlokot, there are many disputes, then as you can imagine, it is a very important question, is it a Deorayta or a Rabbanan? A much more surprising meaning of the question, is Shemitta Deorayta or the Rabbanan nowadays, is very specific to Shemitta. What I just said about the difference, should we be more strict or more lenient, that is all over halacha. But there is something that is very specific to Shemitta, and that is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah raises the following question that we may ask, or the following doubt that we may have. And that is, if we wouldn't walk the land for a whole year, what are we going to eat? Now that's a legitimate question. That's a fair question. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no problem. I give you a promise that the land would give enough in the 6th year, so you would have enough food for the 7th and the 8th year, because you need also for the beginning of the 8th. We all understand that if we do not plow and we do not put the seed in the 7th year, there are not going to be any fruits in the beginning of the 8th year. So we need the 6th year to be extremely successful. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you have my promise. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing thing. But most of us understand that that only applies if we accomplish the mitzvah from the Torah, then we have the promise that the Torah gives. But if the Torah does not, for any reason, as we would see, if the Torah does not command us nowadays, then it stands to reason, as we would say, it does not universally accepted, but it stands to reason that the promise would not apply. So it is very important for us to know the promise is, in a way, the basis for us to allow ourselves to be so strict. I wouldn't have said it unless the Torah itself. The Torah says, I give you a promise so you can go ahead. But if we do not have the promise, then obviously we have to be much more prudent and have much more precaution before we decide on blanket restrictions that may result, chas v'chalila, in food failure or in food failure, which may be disastrous. So these are the questions which are meta questions. Right? These are not right now specific question of, am I allowed to water my melon tree in my garden during the Shemitta? And we are not yet to these type of details. But in the very meta-analysis of the topic of Shemitta, we have to understand, is Shemitta nowadays a Deorayta or a Rabbanan before we go into the more halachic detailed questions that we deal Be'ezrat Hashem from next week on. Okay, so that's our topic for today. Now, as we are going to see, I will give now the structure of the shiur. We would speak about 3 different points that were debated among the Rishonim, that's the early Rabbanim, from let's say 700 up to 1500, and also later, 3 different points that became the hot button, we may say, topics of debate. Should we say that Shemitta nowadays is a Deorayta or a Rabban? So 3 different reasons. Each one of them is enough to declare Shemitta not a Deorayta. We need, in order to paskel, in order to rule that Shemitta nowadays is a Deorayta, we need to decide on all 3 points that Shemitta does apply. So we would review these 3 points, and then we will try to see what is the more or less halachic accepted opinion. There is a gamut here. It's not that all of the authorities nowadays agree to one position, as again, that's not very rare in the halachic field. So there is a difference of opinion, but as also, again, in many other halachic questions, we have the very extreme opinions, and then we have the mainstream, we may say, which is still varied, but it's arranged around, let's say, a certain agreed point. So let's begin. The first debate that we need to discuss is, we speak about Eretz Israel as a holy land, Eretz HaKodesh. But we need to understand that Eretz HaKodesh can be understood in 2 different ways. When we speak about holiness, about Kedusha, there is one sense of holiness which is, we may say, very, I don't want to say spiritual, because the other sense of Kedusha is also spiritual, but it's a figure of speech. So, for example, if I say that a certain person is kadosh, I do not mean, obviously, that we are going to sacrifice him on the altar. All right, so that is clear to every one of us. So holiness sometimes just means close to God. Now, Eretz Israel is holy in the sense of close to God. The Torah says that the eyes of God, Enei Hashem ba, mireshit hashana ve'ad acharit shana. So God looks directly, whatever it means. I don't know right now what it means. I believe that God looks at everywhere in the globe. He doesn't have eyes, so he doesn't. So the whole thing obviously is a metaphor to something, but there is more hashgacha in Eretz Israel than outside of the land, whatever that means. But we know that in that sense, Eretz Israel is closer to God. When one lives in Eretz Israel, he is in a sense closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than in living in Chutz La'aretz, which is a beautiful thing to achieve. So that's just by the fact of living, just by walking around. So by walking around Eretz Israel, you are in a sense closer to God. Does it mean that you cannot be evil? Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that you cannot do horrific things? Unfortunately, you can do them. So that is not in any way, how do you say, teudat bitachon. Yeah. So that's not guarantee for anyone to go to heaven. unfortunately. So we still need to work. But here in Eretz Israel, we are one step closer. That can be said. Fine, beautiful. Now, this holiness is imbued in the land, let's say, at least from the time HaKadosh Baruch Hu told to Avraham Avinu, Lech lecha el haaretz asher areka. You should go to the land that I would show you. And already there is a land that God shows Avraham Avinu, which is Eretz Israel. So this type of holiness, of closeness to God, is maybe from the time of creation, but at least from the time of Avraham Avinu. At least. There is a whole different type of Kedusha, which is the more of halachic, concrete sense of Kedusha. This is the sense in Kedusha in which I say about a cow or a goat, that it is kadosh. Now, obviously, when I speak about my rabbi and I say it's kadosh, it is not in the same sense. I speak about the goat and I say it is kadosh. When I say about the goat that it is kadosh, I don't mean that it is close to God. I mean that it is dedicated for korban. Right? So that's a second understanding of the word kedusha. They have, we can understand why they come from the same root, because both are devoted to God, but they're devoted to God in very different ways. Okay. Now, we should speak now about Eretz Israel. I want to speak about Eretz Israel in the second sense. The first sense, as I said, is clear. It existed at least from the time of Avraham Avinu. It does exist today. Beautiful, Baruch Hashem, excellent. But there is a whole different type of Kedusha, which is the Kedusha not of the land, if you may, but of the ground, the sand, the mud. The fruits growing in Eretz Israel are Kedoshim. What does it mean that they are Kedoshim? It means that we need to separate Trumot Umasrot, right? Tithes and the other gifts. So that is a Kedusha in the second sense of Kedusha we spoke about. Now, I'll give you a simple example. Let's say that I would grow, we would speak about that at length in Yirtzeh Hashem, but let's say that I am growing fruits in Eretz Israel, but on disconnected ground. So I'm taking sand and I disconnect it from the land, I put it on some, even concrete or something, and they grow over water. They are hydroponic fruits, and they are completely disconnected from the land. So according to some of the poskim, these fruits, you would not have to separate, at least not Deorayta. You don't have to separate Trumot to Masrot. There are no laws of Shemitta that apply, maybe, to these fruits. Now, does that mean that they are not holy? In a sense, in the second sense, yes, it means that they are not holy. Just as the goat that they did not dedicate it for Korban is not holy. But they are obviously the fruits of Eretz Israel. So these are the two senses, right, of Peirot Eretz Israel. If I would say in the bracha of Me'en Shalosh, and you know that when we say the Me'en Shalosh, for example, on Peirot Haaretz, then we say Al Haaretz ve'al Peirotea, right, and the end, the Chatima, the end of the bracha. So would I say on fruits that grew on hydrophonic group, not connected to the land, would I say Peirotea? I would assume yes. I would assume yes, because it is Peirot Eretz Israel, but that is regardless of their non-sanctified status in the second sense of the word holy. Okay, so that's after this explanation. Now we ask the following question. How did the land of Eretz Israel, how did the ground become sanctified? There needs to be some act of sanctification, just as if I want to sacrifice a cow or a goat in Beit HaMikdash, I need to go to this animal and say, this is Ola, right? This is Shlamim. In the same manner, Am Israel as a nation at a certain stage should have walked to the land, right, and said, this is now sanctified. When did that thing happen? So it happened in the time of Yehoshua. After going out from Eretz Mitzrayim, they approached Eretz Israel, and they conquered it. By this conquest, they sanctified the land. All right? That's simple, that's agreed. Now comes the question that was debated. the sanctification was achieved by conquest. What happens when we lose our control over the ground? Does that nullify the process of sanctification? Because it comes in opposition, right? If I sanctify by taking command, then I lose sanctification. That would make sense, right? By losing my command over the ground. On the other hand, you can say, no, after it was sanctified, the sanctification stands. Now, that was a machloket Tanaim. Already, Tanaim means that it's already in the 1st century. We have this machloket. And now we understand that when did we lose control of the land at the first time? When the Babylons, Bavlim, led by Nebuchadnezzar, conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took over Eretz Israel. So that is when we lost control of the land for the first time. Did that desanctify? Can I say that? Desanctify. Did that desanctify Eretz Israel? So that was, as I said, a machloket between the Tanaim. I would not read right now the source inside because it throws in some more terms and it makes it more complicated. I did wrote it down, so if someone wants to look it inside later after the shiur, then he's more than invited. But basically it was a dispute between the Tanaim over this question, a very hot dispute, because you understand there are many ramifications for this question. If the sanctity was lost, then that seems to mean that there is no Trumot U'Masrot. There is no Shemitta. Maybe there is no Ola. Everything is on the table. Some of the Tanaim, held the following position. Yes, it is right that the sanctity of the land was lost when Nebuchadnezzar had conquered the land. Fine, we would give you that. But, however, when Ezra came and resettled the land at the time of the return to Zion, Shivat Zion, so we all remember they were for 70 years in exile in Bavel, and then came King Koresh, maybe or maybe not the son of Esther, and he gave them permission to go back to the land. So there came one of the great scholars of that ever lived in our nation, which is Ezra. Chazal said that he was, if there was no Moshe Rabbeinu, he was the second in line to give the Torah, just to understand the personality we speak about. So that is Ezra's affair. And Ezra gathered, just as Moshe Rabbeinu gathered the people from Egypt and took them out, in the same manner, many differences, Ezra gathered whoever wanted to leave Babel and took them to the land of Israel, to Eretz Israel. And he established it was not really an independent state because they were under the Persian rule. So they were like a province of Persia. But it was a Jewish rule. It was a Jewish rule to the extent it was. And the question, and what this Tanaim said was, you know what, it may be that we lost the sanctification of the land when Nebuchadnezzar conquered it, but we re-sanctified it by settling it at the time of Ezra. Okay, so first Kedusha by conquest, second Kedusha by settling. Ezra did not conquer the land. He did not lead an army, but he settled the land. Now you can immediately see what would be the following question. The following question would be, let's accept that Ezra re-sanctified the land. What happened when, again, these settlements were, be'avonoteinu, in our sins, they were uprooted and again expelled in exile. So after the Roman conquest of the land, after the Great Revolt against the Romans, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt even more, then most of Yehuda, of Judea, was not established by Jews, was not populated by Jews. And what is more, the Romans even changed its name after the Bar Kokhba revolt. They changed it from Judea, Provinca Judea, to Provinca Palestinia. That's in order to, they wanted to uproot the Jewish connection. They hoped that by changing the name, they would completely destroy the urge of the Jews to regain their independence. So that's, history has its habit to sometimes repeat itself. So Palestinia was born back. You understand there were no Plishtim. For centuries, there were no Plishtim. The Romans took this Palestinia from the closet of buried secretons of history, right, and re-established them as Provinca Palestinia, and to this day we have Palestinians, which has nothing to do with the original Plishtim. That's just an interesting thought. Be it as it may, the question now becomes clear. Do we again lose the status of sanctity? Because if it was sanctified by settlement, then again, unsettling. But the uprooting of the Jewish settlements does that cancel the sanctification of the land. Now, let's return to the sources now. This approach, meaning that there is no Kedusha after the uprooting of the settlements in Eretz Israel, was, for example, taken by a certain Rabbi Baruch Rabbi Yitzchak, who was from Ashkenaz, and in the beginning of the 12th century, just 2 generations or 1.5 generation after Rashi, he writes a book called Sefer HaTruma. And in this book, there is a section that is dedicated to the laws of Eretz Israel, Hilchot Eretz Israel, and there he writes the following. You can see it in source bet, and I would read it for those of you that do not have the source sheet. Halacha דקדושת הארץ לא קדושה עתה לעניין תרומות ומעשרות. Says Sefer HaTruma, the law is, the halacha is, that there is no sanctity nowadays to Eretz Israel for Trumot u'Maasrot. And you should not say that the Kedusha of Ezra remained. But in this time, בזמן הזה, בטלה. The Kedusha, the sanctity that was given by Ezra, is nullified. ואין חייב מן התורה להפריש תרומה ומעשר. So there is no Torah obligation nowadays for Truma. Maybe there is a Rabbanan, because Rabbanan don't want us to forget Trumot u'Maasrot. So in order to teach us what Trumot u'Maasrot are, they enacted Trumot u'Maasrot in our time as well, but it's not the real Trumot u'Maasrot. Says the Sefer HaTruma, the same goes for Shemitta. ומהטעם הזה נוכל לומר, בשביעית מותר לחרוש ולזרוע בקרקע הגוי, אפילו מדרבנן. Again, it may be that for Jews we would not allow plowing and working the land because we need to remember what Shemitta is, but if a non-Jew owns a land in Eretz Israel, there would be no problem nowadays. Why? Because there is no Shemitta Deorayta. Now you can already feel, I don't want to speak today about what is called Heiter Mechira, the permission of working the land in the Shemitta year by selling it to a goy. So that's a very important topic that we would speak about, but you can already see why this question of Deorayta or the Rabbanan is so important. Because if Shemitta is a Deorayta, it is valid over the whole of the land, regardless who is the owner, and then it won't help to sell the land. But if the Shemitta is only for us not to forget, then it does not depend on the land, it depends on the owner, because we want the Jew not to forget, but we have no problem with the Gentile forgetting the Shemitta. So if a land is owned by a non-Jew, you would be allowed to work it on the Shemitta. So it's a very important distinction. We already see how important this distinction is Shemitta a Deorayta or a Derabana. But, however, yeah.
I don't understand the question to some extent. Maybe I'm listening.
Mm-hmm.
It says in the Torah, it talks in the Torah about Shemitta. Why is there a question that it's not Torah?
Okay, because it may be that the Torah speaks only about times in which the land is sanctified. But if the land is not sanctified, then the mitzvah is not valid. Okay. Now, why should we? I mean, if we do accept that the kedusha was taken by the conquest of Nebuchadnezzar, why? I mean, the position of Sefer Truma seems very reasonable. That in the same way, the kedusha was taken away by the uprooting of the Jews from their settlements in Yehuda. But interestingly enough, that is not really the accepted opinion. Why? Because Rambam, who lived just one generation earlier than Sefer Truma, and as you know, he was not from Ashkenaz, he was born in Spain, and he later went through Morocco, made a small visit in Eretz Israel, and ended up in Egypt. So he wrote his great Codex of Jewish Law, named the Mishneh Torah, and in that he has also a section that speaks about, it's called Zra'im, and it speaks about the mitzvah that relates to the land, to Eretz Israel. And there it says the following. Source, I would read now from the source Gimel, which is, it's from Beit HaBchira, it's from Beit HaMikdash, the Halachot of Beit HaMikdash, but again, he speaks there about the question of Kedushat Haaretz. And he says the following. So look at source Gimel. חיוב הארץ בשביעית ובמעשרות אינו אלא מפני שהוא כיבוש רבים. So our obligation in Eretz Israel to keep Shemitta or to keep Masrot is only because it was conquered by the nation, by the many. But כיוון שנלקחה הארץ מידיהם, when we lost our grip on the land, בטל הכיבוש ונפטרה מן התורה, ממעשרות ובשביעית, שהרי אינה מן ארץ ישראל. When we have lost our command on the land, then the Kedusha is lost, and then there is no more an obligation from the Torah to keep Shmita or Mas. כיוון שעלה עזרא, קידשה. When Ezra came to the land, he again re-sanctified it. Fine, that's what we saw up till now. לא קידשה בכיבוש, and he didn't do it by conquering, אלא בחזקה שהחזיקו בה, but by holding to the land, means settling the land. לפיכך, כל מקום שהחזיקו בו עולי בבל, therefore, every place that was held by עולי בבל, by these people that came, that made עלייה from בבל, נתקדש בקדושת עזרא השנייה, was sanctified by the second sanctity of עזרא. הוא מקודש היום. It is sanctified to this day, says Rambam. ואף על פי שנלקח הארץ ממנו, although Rambam knows very well that we have lost our settlements in Eretz Israel, he says, nonetheless, חייב בשביעית ובמעשרות. We are still obligated in Shmita and Masot. There is a difference between Kedusha that is enacted by an act of war, in which when you lose the war, you lose the sanctity, and a Kedusha that is enacted by the act of settling the land, and then even when you lose the settlement, you are still, the Kedusha is still there. Oh, that's a very interesting thought. That, I mean, that's a shiur to itself. Easily we can speak about that for 45 minutes and more. We don't have the time to delve into this differentiation, but that is my understanding is that basically that's what we mean when we say that our hold to Eretz Israel, it would not be decided by the tanks or by the guns. It would be decided by how many Jews will be able to populate and where. In the end, you have an army camp. It is today here, tomorrow it's somewhere else. An army camp does not really hold to the land. It does not grow roots into the heart of the land. It's only superficial, it's from above. But when you make a settlement, when you plant, when you build houses, even that you do not have the army force, that is the real act of making connection to Eretz Israel. And when you make this connection, this type of connection, this cannot be uprooted. So I think, I believe that is the basic distinction between the Kedusha of Yoshua that depended on conquest and was lost when the conquest was lost, and the Kedusha of Ezra that was dependent on settling the land. And that's why even when we would be taken away, we would still call Eretz Israel our homeland. And that's why the Kedusha would never be lost. I believe that's the basic distinction here, but there are many opinions here, and that's a subject really worth exploring in some other. Maybe we would have in some other year. We would have a course about Kedusha in general, and then we would speak about the Kedusha of Eretz Israel and the difference between this type of Kedusha. Be it as it may, the bottom line is that although there are opinions that the Kedusha of Eretz Israel is not a Deorayta in our days, or at least in the days before the establishing of the State of Israel, which may completely change the game throughout the whole 9 yards. But even if you do not accept if we, for 1 minute, we ignore this unignorable fact of Medinat Israel, then there are opinions who hold that nowadays there is no sanctity to the land. That is the opinion of Sefer HaTruma. And there are opinions, as the Rambam, who said, no, the sanctity that was given by Ezra is everlasting. It cannot be uprooted, regardless of other Jews in Eretz Israel or not. And that is the accepted opinion, because Rambam is Rambam. So that is the accepted opinion. So according to the accepted opinion, the first point of debate about sanctity, you remember the different goals of Shemitta. One of them, you remember, was holiness, sanctity. So you can have a check next to this box. Not completely accepted. We saw there are differing opinions, but the mainstream understanding is that there is sanctity to the land of Eretz Israel nowadays. And for example, Ola would be an Isur Deorayta, and we would not be able to say, no, the land is not really sanctified now. That does not, would not hold. Yeah.
Everybody agrees that with Ezra, the land was re-sanctified.
No, some hold that it was never unsanctified.
Yeah,
some hold that the Kedusha of Yoshua holds to this day.
Bavel, that it didn't get sanctified again. Is there an opinion on that?
No, not that I know of. I mean, everyone agrees that in the time of Beit Sheni, there was sanctity to the land of Israel. The only question was, is it the original question of Kedusha of Yoshua, or is it the new Kedusha of Ezra? Okay. Second point of debate. So we spoke about the first point of debate, which was, is the land sanctified? Now, a second question. Let's take it as given that the land is sanctified. Are there any additional conditions to the application of the mitzvah of Shemitah? Well, the answer is maybe yes. Rambam says, התרומה עם סורס ד', התרומה בזמן הזה, אפילו במקום שהחזיקו עולי בבל, ואפילו בימי עזרא, אינה מן התורה, אלא מדבריהם. Says Rambam, although I told you that the Kedusha of Ezra stands still and is not nullified, nonetheless, the obligation of Trumot nowadays is not mid'oraita. Why not? שאין לך תרומה של תורה אלא בארץ ישראל בלבד, ובזמן, there is an additional condition, says Rambam, not only that it's in Eretz Israel, but you also need שכל ישראל שם. You need all of Am Israel on its land. Now, almost all of the poskim here agree that it doesn't really mean that if one Jew would go to a vacation, that would nullify the obligation of Trumot u'Ma'asot, but you need the majority, as we say, rubo kechulo. So if you have majority, it's like you have all of them. So you need 51 or 50.1% of Am Israel in Eretz Israel in order for the Trumot to be really obligated from the Torah, even if you have a sanctification. And the same goes for Shemitah. Now, why would be this such a condition? So again, these are long sugiyot, and we can learn Gemara here till tomorrow morning. But just to give us the bottom line, and that's my analysis. But what I hold to be, I cannot give you what I do not think. So I will tell you what I do think. And that is that is tied to the second dimension that we have mentioned of the mitzvah of Shemitta, that is the social dimension. Shemitta does not exist in a vacuum. We can imagine, right, some Jewish farmer in a vacuum having a land, and then in the 7th year he's just stopping from working it, which is a beautiful picture, but it's not the picture that the Torah gives of Shemitta. Shemitta is a social mitzvah. It has to do not only with me as the farmer stopping from work, but also with the poor Jews coming in and taking food, and the animals, and that's a social event. You cannot have it alone. Now, when do we consider the Jewish state to really represent or to really have the Jewish social structure? When you have the majority of the Jews living in Eretz Israel. Now, you can imagine that it's highly, highly problematic to count. The Torah promised us that the zera, the seed of Abraham Avinu, would be like the sand of the sea that cannot be counted. So I don't know if we are as many as the sand of the sea, but we cannot be counted because we do not know. We really do not know. You are aware, I guess, of these different censuses that from time to time are being published, but they don't really say who is Jew and who is not Jew. They only tell you who identifies himself as a Jew, which is a very nice thing. And I am not being mezazel in anyone, but if there is someone that sees himself as a Jew because he likes the Jewish, for me, it's not if he was not either born to a Jewish mother or converted in the right way to the Jewish belief, then you're not Jewish. So how do we count? On the other hand, I'm sure that there are many people who do not identify themselves as Jews, but nonetheless are Jewish. What about the 10 tribes? Are they calculated in discounting or not? So all of these are great machlokot, great disputes between the poskim, and it's very, very difficult. Meaning, if we take the modern censuses, we are very close right now to have half of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. But to what degree can we relate on it? I don't have an answer. We need a Sanhedrin in order to make this type of decisions. I guess that at a certain point, we just have to say, we must be more machmir, because we are on the dangerous zone, the zone that we are hoping for, that we have Am Israel in Eretz Israel. But that would mean the Trumot Umasrot would be, even according to the Ram, would be a Deorayta. And that means that some of the leniencies that we are now relying on will not be able to rely on anymore. So again, there are people, Rabbanim greater than I'm just a shul rabbi. But there are people that are much greater that would have to take on their shoulders these type of decisions. When do you decide that we begin to relate, at least as a doubt, as a suffix, that most of the Jews are here in Eretz Israel? Again, that's on the one hand, that is something that we are expecting, we are hoping for, we are praying for, kibbutz galuyot, but on the other hand, we also are fearful of. And that is already said in the Nevuah, in Yeshaya, v'nahar v'rachav levavech. So you would be fearful, but you'd also be thankful. And that's, I guess that's a very concise definition of the whole process of redemption that we are now find ourselves within. So that's, but that's what it is. So according to the Rambam, I think that we can say, but nowadays, even according to these censuses, we do not have the majority of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. So nowadays, because the social dimension of the mitzvah is lacking, then also the whole mitzvah of Shemitta is right now in suspension. And it waits patiently to be reenacted when we would have the majority of the Jews here in Eretz Israel. Now, a similar consideration, slightly different, but it's in this, I believe that it's in the same venue, is being mentioned by Rabbi Zrachi Halevi. Rabbi Zrachi Halevi, also called Baal HaMaor, lived in Provence. Provence is nowadays South France. Back then, it was an independent country. And he lived in France in, I believe that in the end of the 30th century and the beginning of the 14th, but I may be wrong here. I forget for a second. Anyway, so he lived there in Provence, and he is quoted in a certain book as saying that there is no Shemitta nowadays. Why? Because in order to have Shemitta, you need to count. You need to count, as we do now, Sfirat HaOmer, right? So you need to count in order to have Shmita. But the counting of Sfirat HaOmer is every individual, but the counting of the years must be made by a Sanhedrin. As long as we do not have a Sanhedrin, we do not really count the years. The years do not count, which is an interesting idea. Now, in order to have a Sanhedrin, again, you need the majority of the people sitting in Eretz Israel, and then the sages of the land deciding who should sit in the Sanhedrin. And I spoke about that on Shabbat, and I mentioned it in passing, that it seems that the miracle that we will need in order for all of the sages of Am Yisrael to decide who should sit on the Sanhedrin is greater than the miracle of bringing all the Jews to Eretz Israel, unfortunately. So that's the situation. So I'm sure that is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because we are not ripe yet, we are not ready yet to move on to the next stage. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, until you'd be able to develop the correct attitude towards each other of Ahavat Chinam instead of what caused over destruction, then you cannot continue in the process of redemption, which I guess we should be thankful for. So that's the Balamor. But again, it goes in the same direction, which is if you are lacking the social dimension, you cannot have the mitzvah of Shemitah. A third debate, let's imagine that you would have the majority sitting here. But a third debate was regarding the question of, is it enough that you have the majority of the people, however you'd count them, but you'd have the majority of the people sitting in the land of Israel, but do you also need maybe that they will know their original mentions, meaning the original land that was given to them in the time of Yehoshua? I would explain what I just said. In the time of Yehoshua, every tribe was allocated a certain portion of Eretz Israel, and then it was divided between the families. And every family would have its own portion, and then divide it in the next generation, and so on and so forth. Now, every 50 years, even if you sold your land, there would come a year which we call the Jubilee, right? That's the English word, right? The Shnat HaYovel. And in the Shnat HaYovel, the land will return to the original owners. Now, the Shemitah, there is a debate to what extent the Shemitah is connected to the Yovel. Are these two different, it may be seen as two different countings, one of Shemitah and one of Yovel, and they are completely separated, but they can also be seen, and according to Rebbe in source Vav, in source Zayin, they are seen as connected. These are two aspects of the same system. Every 7th year you rest, every 15th year you reset the whole system. Everything returns back and you have a it's a beautiful idea, by the way. It's a way to compensate for the flaws of the capitalist system. Right? You don't want a socialist. You want a capitalist system that would enable people to innovate and to work and to profit from their work, which seems to be moral and profitable. Fine. But the problem with the capitalist system, as we all know, is that in the end, money tends to gather and to be accumulated. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. To be accumulated by few. And they inherit to their children, and then after some years, some people acquire such a power that the money can also give them some ruling and governing power, and we know how that tends to end up. So the Torah says, I will give you a capitalist market, and the Torah is basically, it gives a free market, but every 50 years, we are pressing the reset button. Everyone gets a second chance. Or maybe in 50 years, it's more of a chance to the children. So the children would not suffer from the failures of their parents, and they would not earn too much from what the parents did. They would have to work their way from the beginning. Now, that's a beautiful idea. How to translate that to a modern market in which the capital is money and not land, as was back then. Money was not so important. Land, what played the substantial the role. Now, obviously, that would need a translation that is, again, that's a role for the Sanhedrin to play. How to take this beautiful concept and reenact it in the modern sense. Because nowadays we understand that just reallocating the grounds would do nothing. I mean, if people are able to keep their bank accounts, then it doesn't do anything. But back then it was very important. Now the question is we did the Rabbanans, right, to expand this mitzvah and make it again extra. Anyhow, be it as it may, if we believe that the Yovel is part of the system of the Shemitta. Now, why would it be part of the system of the Shemitta? Because you remember that the third goal of Shemitta is for us to remember that the land does not really belong to us. It belongs to God. Right? So that plays very well, obviously, with the message of the Yovel, which says, it's beautiful, you worked, everything you did with your 10 fingers. You did with your 10 fingers, but now it's not really yours. Give it back. So it's the same message to Shemitta, the same message to Yovel. And when there is no Yovel, because we do not know what is our land, there is no Yovel, says the Gemara, and therefore, believe some of the poskim, there is also no Shemitta, even if we would have the majority of the people sitting in Eretz Israel, because we are not able to have Shemitta, then again we lack one of the dimensions, we are not able to do Yovel, we lack one of the dimensions of Shemitta, and that again renders the whole mitzvah right now inactive and suspended. So these are the three reasons being given by the poskim why the mitzvah of Shemitta Deorayta. As we said throughout this year, it may be that it will be a Rabbanan in order for us not to forget what Shemitta is. But Deorayta, the Shemitta would not apply nowadays. And some of the poskim dispute all of the points that we said. So they say, no, the Shemitta still apply. You don't need that, and you don't need that, and you don't need that. Shemitta apply Deorayta. But the mainstream opinion, and now that's a bottom line, the mainstream opinion is that because of maybe the first reason, but mostly because of the second reason, and also maybe the third reason, there is no Shemitta Deorayta nowadays. So that's a very important conclusion. And again, you see that it is connected, at least in my eyes, it is connected to what we spoke about last week. It's not just formal psukim and words that are being used. It's penetrating the deep logic of this mitzvah, or the reasoning of the Chazal give. It's written in the Torah. What are the reasoning underlying this mitzvah? And if this reasoning cannot be really performed, then the mitzvah loses its actuality. It's an unfortunate thing. It may be that some of us sigh of relief because, now we can sell the land, we can do X and we can do Y, but obviously that's an unfortunate turn of events. And we do hope and we do pray for us to be able to keep Shemitta as we should. But nonetheless, that's the common opinion. Nowadays, Shemitta is not Deorayta. Okay, fine. It is not Deorayta, but what is it? Or maybe it does not exist at all. That's almost universally accepted that it does exist. Why? Because we have testimonies about people keeping Shemitta in Eretz Israel throughout all of history. Throughout all of history. So we know that Shemitta was kept. We can debate if it was a real chiyuv, if it was only done out of minhag. So that can be debated. But it is clear that people kept Shemitta. We have, I bring here from source Chet, from the Ramban. So Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman was born in Spain. He lived in the 30th century, and he made Aliyah himself to Eretz Israel towards the end. Excuse me, what time is it? Okay. Okay, I will. I will try to shorten. I apologize. We began late, so I will try to. Let's see. Maybe we'll just delay to next week. You know what? let's stop here. Let's say that. It is clear that Shemitta was kept. And as I said, we have this testimony from the Ramban. The 30th century was in Eretz Israel. So just look at the last lines in source Chet, that's in the second side of this page. ששנת השמיטה, so that's a testimony from the 30th century. שנת השמיטה מפורסמת בארץ ישראל. It's something that everyone knows about. ומנהג אבותיהם בידיהם להשמיט קרקע. כלומר שנוהגים בה כל קדושת שביעית. So he says it's a clear minhag, it's what is being done, it's coming from the fathers. So again, I cannot give you a specific testimony about a specific Shemitta, but it seems very clear that that was the minhag. So now, what is, if it is not a Deorayta, but it does exist, so on what level of obligation it is? Let's keep it, this question, Mirza Hashem, to next week, and we'll also begin to speak about what are the ramifications and implications of this decision. So thank you for joining us, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we will continue next week.